So in other words, these two issues, the internal issue and the external issue, the resolution of the external conflict and this internal conflict are interlinked. You cannot solve one without the other. You cannot address one without the other. At present, the international community and Israeli governments and Arab governments and the Palestinian Authority, for that matter, are largely focused on this external conflict. The issues of the Palestinian minority inside Israel and the problems facing it have been neglected, largely ignored. The international community is largely indifferent to this issue. At best, they regard it purely as a domestic matter. The fundamental message of our book is that this approach is misguided, because there is this interconnection, and it is dangerous. It's dangerous because unless you recognize this connection, and unless you deal urgently with this internal conflict, there will not be any possibility of long-term sustainable peace in Israel and in Palestine. And how to deal with this conflict and the ways we have in mind, I'll now turn over to Ilan, and he will describe those for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dov and Kate, and I'm very happy to see all of you here. I will be relatively brief because we would very much like to hear your comments and your questions and to respond to them. Let me first of all start with a call for modesty. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict in its internal Israeli context, which the book deals with, in many ways cannot really be resolved, but we believe that it can be better managed, and a lot better managed than it has to date. So what we are trying to do is to indeed outline a better management technique for this very, very difficult conflict. In the limited time that I have, I would like to cover three major issues. Some of the issues that the book deals with will not be covered, but hopefully we'll be able to respond to them in the question and answer. So the questions that we are going to respond to or deal with is, first of all, what could and what should be done concretely to deal with the issues as described by Dov, number one. Number two, what has been the approach of others? In other words, I think that the international context is extremely relevant for dealing with Israel's problems. Israel is not the only country that has a majority-minority tensions. It's one of many countries, and I think that Israel can learn a lot from other societies. So I will try to bring some insights that the book includes and bring it to the table and for your consideration. And thirdly, how realistic is our approach, especially in comparisons to other approaches. One of the approaches is, of course, the traditional approach that the Israeli government has taken all the way from 1948. We are trying to present an alternative, not necessarily an alternative that will be accepted by everyone, because I don't think that there is a consensus position, almost by definition, but I will present a variety of approaches for your considerations and for the discussion that will follow. In our opinion, the key for improving majority-minority relations in Israel, as indeed in other deeply divided societies, as we call them, is first of all to find a middle ground that responds in a balanced way to the basic aspirations of both sides. You cannot start with the assumption that one side, the majority, dictates its solution and the minority remains forever marginalized. This is a recipe, as we argue, for an explosion, for disaster. So first of all, you have to try to find a middle ground, and obviously different people will have different definitions for what the middle ground may be. Secondly, we must understand that, we argue, one cannot improve the situation by merely extending equal rights to individuals, we would argue. We must consider creatively the granting of significant collective rights to the minority. In other words, our argument substantially is that classical liberalism is simply insufficient. It's a necessary condition for improvement, but insufficient condition. In chapter 7 of our book, we therefore offer a comprehensive political program that tries to meet those particular goals. This political program, in essence, recognizes Israel's Jewishness, which has been supported by the international community since 1947, the famous partition resolution, and is supported by the majority of Israeli citizens today. But at the same time, and this is a sense of balance we are trying to introduce into the discussion, our program extends political recognition to the Arab minority, political recognition, and argues for significantly more equality. Now, let me then move forward specifically and talk about some of the elements that are included in our program. For lack of time, I will limit myself to 6 different ideas. We have more ideas, and incidentally, there are several individuals who are working along the same lines as we speak, people like Sami Smucha and others. And so I think that we are part of a community of Jewish liberals, progressive, I hope we can call ourselves, that are trying to work through this problem. Let me give you 5 or 6 of our ideas. Idea number 1 is the establishment of what we would call functional autonomy as against territorial autonomy for Palestinians in some areas of public life, allowing them, in other words, to manage their affairs. One such area, maybe the single most important one, is the area of education. Today, this particular field is very tightly controlled by the state and managed by the majority, administratively, curricularly, and so on and so forth. In other words, the superintendent of Arab education in Israel is a Jewish man, is not an Arab. We don't see a reason for it. The curricular control, and so on and so forth, is not in the hands of the Arabs. We think this is one of the areas that autonomy ought to be expanded. Secondly, nominating Palestinians to positions of responsibility in all branches of the Israeli bureaucracy, including the executive, the courts, and so on and so forth. Today, there are merely 6.2% Arabs in the bureaucracy. Okay, so this is about 1/3 of what it should be. If you have 20% Arabs, 6.2, 6.3% would amount to about 1/3 in comparative terms. I think that it's very, very important to go beyond token appointments and to move more aggressively in the area of the bureaucracy, business, and, by the way, academia. Okay, academia is also, despite the fact that the academics tend to be liberal and open-minded and so forth, you'll be very hard-pressed to find any Arabs whatsoever as presidents, provosts, rectors, deans, you name it. I think Majid al-Hajj, that maybe some of you know, is the only one that I am aware of. Now, once again, let me say that the picture is not entirely negative. There are Supreme Court justices who are Arabs. The head, for example, of the panel that passed the ruling on President Katsav is George Kara, who is a Christian from Akko. So you do have here and there some appointments, but it's far from being enough. And the Israeli government essentially has accepted this as being far from being enough. But that's the way to go.